It often begins quietly, not with a scream or a headline or a courtroom revelation. It begins with a question that refuses to go away, a ledger that doesn't quite balance, a memory that feels altered, a sense, subtle but persistent, that something important is being hidden in plain sight. History, we like to believe, is a solid thing, a record of what happened, arranged neatly in books and archives. But history is also fragile. It depends on witnesses who live long enough to speak, on documents that survive long enough to be read, on truths that are allowed to surface. When those conditions fail, history does not announce the loss. It simply grows quieter. This story begins in that quiet. Across decades and continents, certain lives ended at moments when their voices seemed closest to being heard. People of wealth, influence, intellect, or access. Individuals who had moved behind the curtain of systems most of us only glimpse from the outside. They were financiers, scientists, technologists, journalists, executives. Different professions, different temperaments, different beliefs. Yet they shared a common threshold. Each stood at the edge of disclosure, about to reveal something uncomfortable about the structures that shape modern life. What happened next is not a single narrative, but a pattern of echoes. An unexpected death, an official explanation delivered quickly, evidence misplaced, sealed, or quietly reinterpreted, projects abandoned, testimony never given. And over time, the public memory softens. The questions remain, but they lose urgency. New headlines arrive. The world moves on. This is not a story about certainty. It is not an accusation, nor a verdict. It is a meditation on absence, on what happens when knowledge disappears along with the people who carried it. On how power, whether corporate, governmental, or cultural, does not always need to destroy truth outright. Sometimes it only needs to delay it, confuse it, or outlast it. Imagine standing in a vast archive where entire shelves are missing. The gaps are invisible unless you know what once stood there. This documentary journey explores those gaps, not to fill them with speculation, but to sit with them, to ask why they exist, and to reflect on what it means when truth depends so heavily on human survival. In every era, societies produce whistleblowers and visionaries, people who notice contradictions between official stories and lived realities. Often they are not radicals. Many begin as loyal insiders, believers in the systems they serve. It is only later, after anomalies accumulate, after private doubts turn into documented concerns, that loyalty fractures into responsibility. At that moment, a human choice emerges. Speak or stay silent. Record or forget. And once that choice is made, the individual steps into a space where the personal and the historical collide. This series does not ask you to assume hidden hands behind every tragedy, nor does it ask you to dismiss coincidence as comfort. Instead, it invites a slower, more demanding posture, curiosity without certainty, empathy without naivete, skepticism without cynicism. We will move through stories that are unresolved, not because they lack facts, but because the facts themselves were interrupted. We will hear about investigations that ended early, technologies that vanished, testimonies that were never delivered. And at each step, we will return to a central question. What does it cost a society when inconvenient knowledge is lost? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that secrets are actively buried, but that we grow accustomed to their disappearance. That silence becomes normal, that the absence of truth feels less alarming than the disruption it might cause. As this journey unfolds, keep that thought close, not as a conclusion, but as a companion. Because the line between what we know and what we are allowed to know is not fixed. It shifts with time, memory, and attention. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that end too soon, leaving behind not answers, but an enduring, uneasy question. What were we about to learn? It started with a mansion and a pool, the quiet kind of wealth that hides in plain view. On December 15, 2017, Barry and Honey Sherman were found seated beside their indoor swimming pool in their Toronto home, suspended by belts looped around a railing. At first glance, it looked orderly. Too orderly. The initial police assessment labeled it a murder-suicide, a private tragedy and unspoken pain. But something in the scene resisted that narrative. The Shermans' wrists were tied behind their backs. Their bodies were posed identically. There were no suicide notes, no signs of mental unraveling, no history of violence or illness between them. And most crucially, there was no reason. Barry Sherman was not a recluse. He was a disruptor. As the founder of one of the world's largest generic drug companies, Apotex, he had spent his career undercutting the pricing empires of major pharmaceutical firms. His business model threatened an entire industry built on exclusivity and inflated margins. Where others saw billion-dollar profits, he saw opportunity for access and affordability. But that vision earned him enemies. For years, Sherman had been embroiled in legal conflicts with some of the most powerful pharmaceutical conglomerates in the world. Rivals accused him of destabilizing the market. Whispers of death threats were not new to him. But in the weeks leading up to his death, something shifted. He was preparing to testify before a Canadian parliamentary committee investigating drug price inflation. Sources close to him said he had compiled evidence implicating several multinational companies in a price-fixing scheme. Evidence that tied together insurers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and even regulatory bodies. The scope of the revelation could have triggered billions in fines and dismantled entrenched power structures. And then he was gone. What followed was a masterclass in misdirection. The investigation was quietly moved from homicide to financial crimes. Surveillance footage from nearby homes vanished into sealed archives. Autopsy findings showing signs of restraint and neck trauma inconsistent with hanging were suppressed, then released only after private investigators raised alarms. Key pieces of evidence disappeared from police custody. The case officially remains unsolved. To this day, no one has been charged. No motive formally accepted, but the timing haunts the memory. 48 hours. That's all that stood between Barry Sherman and the microphone, where his voice could have altered an industry. Honey Sherman, too, was more than collateral. A philanthropist, a community anchor, a woman known for her strength and clarity. She stood beside Barry in business and in belief. Their deaths weren't just a loss to family or company. They were the silencing of a message that had nearly reached the public. We often think of secrets as things hidden in vaults or behind firewalls, but sometimes a secret is a person, a body of knowledge, lived and carried, waiting for the right moment to be shared. When that person disappears, the truth they hold flickers, still warm, still close, and then begins to fade. What does it mean when two of the most informed voices on pharmaceutical corruption vanish just as the world begins to listen? How do we measure the weight of what was not said, not recorded, not witnessed? Perhaps the most fragile part of any system is not the information itself, but the human vessels who bear it. Their courage, their vulnerability, their mortality. In the stillness of that Toronto mansion, beneath the fluorescent lights of an indoor pool, a message died with the couple who tried to deliver it. And the echo of that message asks us still, when truth knocks at the gate of power, how often is the answer not denial, but disappearance? It was a summer night in Manhattan, the kind that hums with heat and hush. In a high-security cell inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a man with too many secrets lay dead. August 10, 2019. Jeffrey Epstein. Officially, suicide. Unofficially, a rupture in the illusion of accountability. Epstein wasn't just a financier. He was a gatekeeper to the forbidden corridors of global influence. His life, and eventually his death, revolved around a simple yet devastating premise: control through compromise. For decades, he had allegedly run an elaborate network of entrapment, hosting powerful men, recording their most shameful acts, and building an archive of leverage so vast it bordered on myth. His guest list was a who's who of the elite: presidents, royals, tech moguls, Hollywood giants. His private island, a fortress of privacy, was wired with cameras. His properties, palatial, pristine, were curated stages for performances that no one wanted exposed. But exposure had begun. Epstein had been arrested again, this time under federal indictment, and something shifted. He was no longer untouchable. His legal team claimed he was ready to cooperate, to trade information in exchange for safety. There was talk of names, of tapes, of deals behind closed doors. He was said to be optimistic. And then everything went dark. That night, every safeguard failed. Surveillance cameras malfunctioned. Guards reportedly fell asleep. His cellmate was transferred, and the suicide watch, standard for high-risk prisoners, had been lifted days earlier under suspicious circumstances. It was not the chaos of oversight. It was the choreography of absence. The autopsy that followed did little to reassure. Multiple fractures in his neck, including the hyoid bone, injuries more common in strangulation than hanging. Blood patterns, ligature marks, time of death estimates, none aligned neatly. But within hours, the case was declared closed, suicide, a narrative locked in place. What makes Epstein's death so chilling is not just the suspicious circumstances, but what it interrupted. The criminal proceedings were in motion, the victims were speaking, the documents were piling. A reckoning seemed imminent. And then the linchpin was gone. The files seized from his properties have never been made public. The recordings, if they exist, remain in sealed custody. Requests for access have been denied on national security grounds. National security for the secrets of a private citizen. The phrase "convenient death" is often used too loosely, but here it feels insufficient. Epstein's demise wasn't just convenient. It was final, not just for him, but for any honest accounting of the system he represented. In the wake of his death, the structure he built remains curiously intact. Many of the names associated with him have returned to public life unscathed. The investigation slowed, the memory blurred, and the survivors, those who endured the real cost, were left once again without justice. There are truths so volatile they destabilize more than careers. They erode trust in institutions themselves. Perhaps that is what Epstein represented, not a man, but a fracture point in our collective understanding of power, corruption, and consequence. His death leaves behind a question with no satisfying answer. When someone holds the keys to the darkest rooms of global power, who decides whether those doors are opened or permanently locked? And if one man's silence can protect so many, what does that say about the world those many still govern? Sometimes the most powerful secrets are not buried. They are cremated in the fire of a story that ends too suddenly, too neatly, too soon. The walls of the Spanish prison were thick, but not thick enough to muffle what was coming. On June 23, 2021, John McAfee, tech magnate, digital provocateur, and eternal fugitive, was found dead in his cell. The story was swift. Suicide by hanging, just hours after a court approved his extradition to the United States. But for those who followed McAfee's journey, the story refused to sit still. He had always been a man of contradictions, brilliant and erratic, paranoid, yet prescient. From building the first commercial antivirus software to wandering the jungles of Belize, McAfee defied classification. In his final years, he claimed he had uncovered something vast, a network of surveillance and financial manipulation stretching across governments and corporations. He called it the dead man's switch. The idea was as wild as it was calculated. If anything happened to him, a cascade of digital files would release themselves into the world. Files, he claimed, containing proof of government overreach, illegal market manipulation, and the hidden architecture of global control. He was no longer just a whistleblower. He had become the Vault. McAfee's warnings weren't vague. He spoke openly about the CIA, the NSA, the way antivirus software could be weaponized into spyware. He accused intelligence agencies of using commercial software as Trojan horses, of infiltrating our devices under the guise of protection. And as the world raced into the cryptocurrency era, McAfee raced ahead, only to claim he had found rot there too. He alleged that central banks were deliberately crashing crypto markets to accumulate digital reserves in secret. That behind the volatility, a quiet consolidation was taking place, an effort to dismantle decentralization before it could flourish. And then he died. The official report said he hanged himself with torn bedsheets. But the inconsistencies multiplied. Inmates reported hearing voices and scuffles before his body was found. Surveillance footage from the hallway vanished, labeled corrupted. Within minutes of the death being made public, McAfee's servers, home to the alleged dead man's switch, went offline in unison. It was as if someone had known exactly where and how to strike. The Spanish authorities cremated his body within 48 hours without waiting for family. No independent autopsy, no time for questions. Even in death, McAfee left messages. His social media accounts, managed by a team, released cryptic clues, hints of backups, insurance files, digital trails. But nothing concrete ever emerged. The data dump never came. Whether it was a bluff, a failure, or a theft, no one could say. What lingers is not just the mystery of how he died, but what died with him. What if his claims were true? What if the architecture of our digital lives, our communication, our money, our identity, is not as neutral or secure as we imagine? What if the tools we rely on were designed not just for convenience, but for control? John McAfee thrived on chaos, and perhaps he contributed to his own undoing. But that chaos was often a mirror, reflecting systems we take for granted, exposing the fragility behind the facade of security. His story ends not with a trial or confession, but with a vanished man and a missing message. And the question that follows in the silence: did we just lose a madman, or did we silence a messenger carrying proof we weren't ready to see? The California hills were quiet that December, softened by winter's hush. But inside a modest home, something had broken. On December 8, 2020, Dr. Brandy Vaughan, a former pharmaceutical insider turned outspoken critic, was found dead. She was 47, healthy, focused. Preparing for testimony that never came, her death was labeled natural. Cardiac-related, officials said, but the shadows surrounding it told another story. Vaughan wasn't a conspiracy theorist. She was once part of the system, a sales executive at one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. She knew the language, the tactics, the calculations. And that made her dangerous because she chose to speak. After leaving the industry, she founded Learn the Risk, a public education platform dedicated to revealing how pharmaceutical companies manipulate clinical data, shape public narratives, and suppress evidence of harm. She had no desire to incite fear. Her aim, she said, was transparency. But transparency has a cost. Her presentations drew large audiences. She published internal documents. She challenged regulatory bodies and accused them of collusion. Most damning of all was her assertion that the official vaccine injury reporting system captured less than 1% of actual cases. If true, it would mean that public health risks had been systematically hidden under the banner of progress. In the months leading to her death, the tone of her communications changed. She spoke of being watched, of strange break-ins where nothing was stolen, but everything was slightly moved. Anonymous threats, surveillance vehicles. She documented it all, and she left a clear public message. I am not suicidal. If anything happens to me, investigate. Then, just weeks before she was set to testify in a major case against her former employer, she was gone. The autopsy offered no clarity. Her family's request for a second, independent analysis was denied. Toxicology reports were inconclusive. Her digital archive, her life's work, was dismantled almost overnight. The Learn the Risk website disappeared. Her social media platforms were suspended. Years of research, case studies, and testimonies erased. To some, it looked like digital housekeeping. To others, it looked like erasure. And yet what Vaughan represented was not just a fight against corporate power. It was a reflection of how vulnerable truth can be in a system designed to protect its own interests. She didn't claim to have all the answers, but she asked the right questions. Who decides what data is valid? Who audits the auditors? When the same entities profit from products and regulate their safety, where does the conflict of interest end? Her death marked more than the loss of a person. It signaled the silencing of a movement built on credibility, not conjecture. In a world saturated with information, it's tempting to dismiss inconvenient voices as noise. But some voices come from experience, from the inside. And when those voices fall silent, we're left with sanitized versions of events, stories trimmed of their thorns. Dr. Brandy Vaughan warned us about the power of narrative, especially when it's bought, polished, and protected. And in the space she left behind, the question lingers. What happens when the truth we need is carried by someone the system refuses to protect? A landfill is no place for the end of a man like John Wheeler III. And yet, on December 31st, 2010, that's where his body was found, discarded among the refuse of a Delaware waste facility. Once a respected Pentagon official, Wall Street advisor, and public servant, Wheeler's final hours were shrouded in confusion, fear, and silence. He had spent his life moving through the corridors of power, an insider with access to sensitive defense projects and high-level financial operations. But toward the end, he was chasing something darker, something corrosive. Wheeler had uncovered what he believed to be a sprawling money laundering operation. Billions in taxpayer funds, he discovered, were being funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts. The money trail wound its way through defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and some of the largest banks in the world. He had the documents, bank statements, contract records, internal emails, and he was preparing to deliver them to Congress, to prosecutors, to the public. And then he vanished. The last known footage of Wheeler shows him stumbling through a Wilmington parking garage, disoriented, muttering that he had been poisoned. Friends described him as unusually paranoid in the days leading up to his disappearance. He believed he was being followed, watched, erased. When his body was found days later, it bore signs of assault, blunt force trauma, bruising, but no official cause of death was established. Police ruled out foul play. Just another lost man in a disordered world. But Wheeler wasn't just anyone. His disappearance stalled the investigation he had set in motion. The federal agents he'd been working with were reassigned. The evidence he'd gathered disappeared into sealed files protected under national security exemptions. A bureaucratic blackout. And just like that, the momentum was gone. No headlines, no hearings, no accountability. What happened to John Wheeler is not simply a question of murder, it's a question of erasure. A man with access to the inner workings of government finance had uncovered a systemic betrayal. And in the space between discovery and disclosure, he was removed. We often imagine whistleblowers as loud figures, megaphones in hand, shouting against injustice. But many are quiet, methodical, hopeful. They believe the system will correct itself if only it can see what's wrong. Wheeler was one of those. But even hope has limits. The machinery he sought to expose was too large, too insulated. Banks that move billions, agencies that define secrecy, corporations that profit from perpetual conflict. These are not accidental forces. They are sustained through design. And when that design is threatened, it defends itself, not through trials or denials, but through silence. In the end, Wheeler's death left a paper trail without a voice, a map with no one to read it. And the question remains, how many crimes remain hidden, not because they are too complex, but because those who uncover them never live long enough to explain? The door to his Brooklyn apartment was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no farewell note, just the quiet, devastating finality of absence. On January 11, 2013, Aaron Swartz, programming prodigy, open access advocate, and one of the brightest minds of the digital age, was found dead by suicide. He was 26. To some, Aaron was a hacker, to others, a freedom fighter. But at his core, he was something simpler and more dangerous to the status quo. A believer in information as a public good. Swartz helped shape the Internet as we know it. He co-authored RSS when he was just a teenager. He played a pivotal role in Reddit's early development. He championed transparency, fought against censorship, and resisted the privatization of knowledge. He understood long before most that data wasn't just technical, it was political. At the time of his death, he was facing federal prosecution for downloading millions of academic papers from JSTOR using MIT's network. The intent, according to prosecutors, was criminal. But to Aaron, it was ethical. He believed that publicly funded research shouldn't be locked behind paywalls. That knowledge, especially knowledge paid for by taxpayers, belonged to everyone. But that wasn't the full story. Behind the scenes, Swartz had been investigating something far more sensitive, the mechanisms of digital surveillance. He had uncovered evidence of secretive agreements between major tech companies and intelligence agencies, data-sharing pipelines that bypassed legal oversight. Years before Edward Snowden's revelations, Swartz had glimpsed the architecture of mass surveillance, and he was preparing to speak. He had registered to present at a major technology conference. His talk, according to friends, would expose how user data was being harvested, indexed, and analyzed in real time, often without consent, always without transparency. He had the documentation, he had the names. Then came the prosecution. The charges for downloading articles carried the weight of decades in prison. Felony after felony stacked like bricks. A pressure campaign, not just to punish, but to break. Swartz, already sensitive to the weight of injustice, was cornered. His family and supporters maintained that the prosecution was never truly about academic articles. It was about silencing a growing threat to unchecked surveillance, a preemptive strike against someone who knew too much and had the platform, intellect, and moral clarity to change the conversation. After his death, the files he was preparing vanished. His devices were seized, his research unreleased. What might have followed, a whistleblowing cascade, a public reckoning, was instead buried beneath the weight of grief and confusion. We often say that Aaron Swartz died for information freedom, but that's only half the truth. He died at the intersection of knowledge and power. He saw how data was being weaponized, not just for profit, but for control, and he tried in his way to stop it. He was not reckless. He was principled. He didn't seek chaos. He sought accountability. And now we are left to wonder, what truths were lost when the system chose to prosecute a mind rather than listen to it? What futures were erased when the voice asking the hardest questions went silent? On a summer night in Monterey, California, a pioneer fell, not from obscurity, but from the edge of a future he had quietly been building. Gary Kildall was found dead on July 11, 1994, the result of what authorities called a simple accident. A fall, a head injury, an unfortunate end. But simplicity has a way of unraveling when examined too closely. Kildall was one of the forgotten architects of the digital age. He created one of the earliest personal computer operating systems, a foundation upon which modern computing was built. History remembers others as household names, but those who understood the lineage of innovation knew Kildall's importance. And in his later years, he had turned his attention away from software and toward energy. What he was developing wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to dominate headlines. It was elegant, technical, and quietly revolutionary. Software designed to decentralize energy distribution. A system that could allow homes and communities to generate, store, and trade renewable energy directly with one another, without reliance on centralized utilities. In effect, it threatened the logic of scarcity. Kildall believed energy independence was a human right. His smart grid concepts would have undermined monopolies that depended on centralized control and opaque pricing. He refused buyout offers. He planned to release his work openly, allowing communities, not corporations, to decide how energy flowed. Then came the night at the bar. Witnesses recalled seeing unfamiliar men watching him closely. Others said the injuries didn't match the official account. The medical report showed inconsistencies, multiple impacts, patterns difficult to reconcile with a single fall. But the investigation ended quickly. No follow-up, no scrutiny. Within days of his death, Kildall's research lab was broken into, not vandalized, not ransacked, targeted. Computers containing his energy work were taken, nothing else. The theft was precise, professional. The software he had spent years developing disappeared, and with it a future. There was no public outcry, no trial. The world moved on. Energy markets remained centralized. Innovation followed safer paths. Kildall's story reminds us that not all revolutions announce themselves. Some arrive quietly, written in code, waiting to be shared. And sometimes those revolutions end not with resistance, but with removal. What was lost wasn't just a man or a program. It was a question. What might the world look like if power, literal power, had been placed back into the hands of ordinary people? In the absence of that answer, the light stayed on, the systems remained, and the silence deepened. How many futures have been postponed, not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient? The streets of Los Angeles never sleep, but on June 18, 2013, one of them swallowed a story before it could be told. Michael Hastings, a fearless investigative journalist known for piercing the veil of power, died in a fiery car crash. His Mercedes exploded against a palm tree at high speed, flames rising against the pre-dawn sky. The narrative was immediate, tragic accident, but the timing and the man complicated that simplicity. Hastings had made his name confronting powerful institutions. He brought down generals, exposed military corruption, and chronicled the subtle mechanisms by which narratives were shaped and dissent managed. At the time of his death, he was working on his most explosive piece yet, a story about intelligence agencies manipulating the media, not just with spin, but with systemic control. He had been investigating digital surveillance, covert propaganda operations, and the use of artificial intelligence to steer online discourse. His research touched the darkest corners of programs like Operation Mockingbird, once a Cold War relic, now reimagined for the digital age. Hastings had gathered evidence suggesting that intelligence operatives were embedded in newsrooms, influencing coverage, suppressing investigations, and steering public perception with manufactured consent. He believed that social media platforms were being used as laboratories for psychological operations, bots, false trends, artificial outrage. The public, he warned, was being herded. Then he sent a final email, To colleagues, he wrote that he was being followed, that he was onto something big, that he was going off the radar for safety, that the FBI was investigating him. Hours later, his car was seen accelerating unnaturally fast before veering into a tree. Witnesses described a flash before the impact. Experts raised questions. Could the car have been hacked? Modern vehicles, after all, are computers on wheels. The investigation ruled out foul play. But doubts persisted. No mechanical faults were found. No driver impairment. The speed, the fire, the force, none of it aligned easily. And the story he was writing? It was never published. His notes, devices, and files were seized by federal agents. National security, they said. Hastings once wrote, "The people who cover national security live in fear of being cut out, of not getting that call, of losing access." But he wasn't afraid. He chased the story, knowing it could cost him everything. In losing him, we lost more than a journalist. We lost the thread of a question still hanging in the air. Who shapes what we believe? When media becomes a tool, not of inquiry, but of influence, how do we discern what's real? Michael Hastings died in fire, but the real burn is what might have followed, an expose not just of lies, but of the machinery that manufactures them. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, did we lose him to accident or to the very system he was about to reveal? It was a long road in Oklahoma, stretching into night, when Karen Silkwood's car veered off course, November 13, 1974. The headlights faded, the documents she carried, never found, and so vanished one of the most pivotal truth-tellers in the nuclear age. Silkwood was not a rebel. She was a technician, a union member, a woman who wanted to do her job safely. But inside the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant, she uncovered something that shook her faith in the system she worked for. Radiation exposure levels falsified, safety protocols ignored, and regulatory agencies turning a blind eye. Her discovery wasn't abstract. She herself had been contaminated. Plutonium was found in her body, her apartment, even in her toothpaste. And still, she persisted. She began gathering documents, internal memos, falsified records, proof of corporate negligence. She arranged a meeting with a journalist and union representative. That drive was meant to deliver the evidence. She never made it. Her car was found crashed into a concrete culvert. Investigators initially called it an accident, maybe fatigue. But the deeper they looked, the more questions surfaced. Skid marks suggested she was forced off the road. There were traces of another vehicle's paint on her bumper, and the documents, the ones she told friends would blow the whistle, were gone. Official explanations offered little comfort. Over time, the case grew cold and the nuclear industry carried on. But the silence left behind was deafening. Karen Silkwood was not trying to upend a system. She was trying to fix it. She believed that if people saw the truth, they would act, that safety mattered more than profit, that human lives outweighed shareholder value. Her death proved how naive that belief might have been. Because in the end, it wasn't just plutonium that was radioactive, it was the truth she tried to expose. What Silkwood uncovered wasn't just corporate failure, it was collusion between industry and oversight, profit and policy. Her documents, if real, would have revealed a systemic willingness to cut corners even when the cost was cancer, contamination, and lives lost slowly in silence. She was followed, intimidated, warned. But she drove on. That final journey became a symbol, not just of courage, but of how fragile truth can be when it's carried in human hands. There was no archive for her evidence, no digital backup, just paper, intention, and a belief that someone would listen. We remember Silkwood not because her story ended with justice, but because it didn't, because she stood at the edge of revelation and never made it across. And so we ask, When the system meant to protect us becomes the one to fear, who ensures the protectors are watched? Who speaks when the ones who tried vanish without a trace? The water was still, almost serene, when they found him. A North Carolina river carried the body of Dr. Jeff Bradstreet on June 19, 2015, face down, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The official verdict was suicide, but for those who knew him and knew what he was working on, the word felt like a placeholder. Bradstreet was more than a doctor. He was a lifeline for thousands of families seeking answers outside the conventional medical narrative. His work focused on autism, vaccines, and the biochemical mechanisms that might link the two. To some, he was a fringe figure. To others, a pioneer. His clinic treated children using unconventional methods, chelation therapy, detox protocols, experimental enzyme treatments. His results were controversial but hard to ignore. Parents reported measurable improvements. Children, once locked in silence, began to speak. Bradstreet's research had led him to a substance called nagalase, an enzyme he believed interfered with immune function and might be linked to cancer, neurological disorders, and yes, vaccine ingredients. He claimed to have found elevated levels of nagalase in autistic children and proposed that its presence might be deliberately introduced through immunization. Then the raid came. Days before his death, federal agents stormed his clinic. They seized patient files, computers, research data. No charges were filed, but the message was unmistakable. Bradstreet went underground. He told friends he was being targeted. He made plans to continue his work in secrecy. He believed he had something that would change everything. Then the river. The bullet entered his chest from an angle inconsistent with suicide. The gun was never recovered. His family, devastated but resolute, hired private investigators who raised red flags about the trajectory, the scene, the timing. But no further investigation was opened. His death, like so many before, was labeled closed. And yet it opened something else. Within months, several alternative medicine practitioners working on similar research were also found dead. Different places, similar patterns. Heart attacks, suicides, accidents. The string of unexplained deaths sent waves of fear through the medical freedom community, and a surge of silence. Bradstreet's research, like the man himself, was difficult to categorize. He operated in the gray zone between science and suspicion, but he never stopped asking questions that institutions found uncomfortable. He challenged narratives not with rhetoric, but with data, with patient stories, with persistence. What does it mean when a man investigating the vulnerabilities of our most protected medical practices disappears under circumstances too tidy to trust? When science becomes settled not by peer review, but by elimination. Dr. Jeff Bradstreet's work was never about absolutes. It was about possibilities. Dangerous, destabilizing possibilities. His loss wasn't just personal, it was intellectual, it was cultural, because the silence that followed didn't just quiet his voice, it chilled 1,000 others. And in that silence, a question lingers. How do we protect inquiry when it threatens the very systems meant to uphold it? They said it was a heart attack. July 11, 1994. Gary Kildall, the man who could have changed the world twice, was declared dead after a fall in a bar. But by then, something far greater had already been lost. Not just a life, but an idea. The idea that control over energy, like knowledge or data, could be reclaimed. Kildall was no stranger to erasure. Decades earlier, his revolutionary operating system, CP/M, had been sidelined in the deal that made Microsoft a household name. His story became one of the great what-ifs of the computer age. But he didn't dwell on it. He kept building. And what he was building in the years before his death might have been even more disruptive than his early software. He envisioned a future where households weren't just consuming energy, but producing it, storing it, sharing it. His software platform could coordinate solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries into a smart, decentralized energy grid. A network where communities could power themselves, sell excess electricity, and eliminate the need for centralized utilities. No more monopolies, no more price manipulation, no more engineered scarcity. It was a clean, elegant design, one that could have leveled the playing field, not just economically, but ecologically. And that, perhaps, made it dangerous. Kildall refused to sell his patents to the energy giants that came knocking. He believed in open access, in technology as liberation, not leverage. He wanted to release the platform for free, globally, unchained from corporate control. Then came the night in Monterey. Witnesses reported strange men in suits watching him. Security footage was never recovered. The head injuries, according to medical experts, suggested more than a fall. Blunt trauma. Multiple impacts. But the case was closed quickly. No suspects. No autopsy beyond the minimum required. No investigation into what he was working on. Within days, his lab was robbed, not ransacked, targeted. The only things missing were the servers and drives containing his latest energy code. The rest was untouched. Not even the expensive hardware was taken. This wasn't theft, it was extraction. His family received no answers. The media moved on. A footnote again for a man who had been central to shaping our digital present and who might have rewritten our energy future. We often talk about innovation as an unstoppable force. But innovation, like any truth, can be fragile. It depends not just on genius, but on protection. When the wrong interests are challenged, when too much control is threatened, even the most promising ideas can be buried, quietly, efficiently, completely. Kildall's legacy is bittersweet. His early work lives on in fragments, in the devices we use every day. But the energy platform he envisioned? Gone. Forgotten by most. Preserved only in whispers and what-ifs. So we must ask, how many breakthroughs have we missed? Not because we lacked the vision, but because the visionaries were removed before the light could spread. What future did Gary Kildall see? And who made sure we would never reach it? The waters were calm, the skies clear. Yet the world shifted on June 23, 2021, when John McAfee was found dead in his Spanish prison cell. It was a familiar pattern, but the questions it raised were anything but routine. Here was a man who thrived on chaos, cryptic, flamboyant, unpredictable, and yet his final act felt staged. Too neat, too quiet. McAfee's death was ruled a suicide, but the deeper you looked, the harder that label was to trust. For years he had warned that if he were ever found dead by apparent suicide, it would not be by his own hand. He even had a tattoo etched onto his arm. Whacked Oi. A message or a prophecy, depending on how you read it. His warnings weren't empty theater. McAfee had made enemies in high places. His career as a cybersecurity pioneer was only the beginning. What followed was a volatile blend of political exile, cryptographic innovation, and relentless public accusations against intelligence agencies, banks, and powerful corporations. He claimed his antivirus software had been co-opted by intelligence agencies to spy on millions. He alleged that the cryptocurrency market was being secretly manipulated by central banks and government agencies working in tandem. And most controversially, he spoke of a data cache, what he called his dead man switch, that would expose a web of global corruption if he were ever silenced. The moment his death was announced, that switch, if it existed, never triggered. Instead, his servers went offline. Instantly, his digital presence vanished with military precision. No leaks, no files, just silence. And the body? Cremated within 48 hours before his family could intervene. No second autopsy, no opportunity to question the cause. The timing was as suspicious as the disappearance of his work. Some wrote him off as paranoid, a showman courting chaos. But others saw in his flamboyance a desperate urgency to be heard. He had seen behind the curtain, and what he saw terrified him. The truth may never be known, but what remains is the eerie alignment between his warnings and his end. And in that silence we must ask, what happens when the only safeguard for the truth is a single person? When the vault and the key are the same, how do we protect the contents if the person vanishes? McAfee lived like a storm, unpredictable and impossible to contain. But his death was still, too still, a moment of quiet where there should have been thunder. And in that unnatural quiet, we are left with a final echo. Did he die because of what he knew, or because of what he was about to reveal? And if the answer is yes to either, what else now will never see the light? They were visionaries, agitators, architects of inconvenient truth. Some held degrees and patents, others carried stories, files, testimonies. What united them wasn't just the magnitude of what they knew, it was the timing of their silence. Always just before the testimony, just before the release, just before the shift that might have changed everything. Across continents and decades, we followed their footsteps. Barry and Honey Sherman, poised to expose pharmaceutical collusion. Jeffrey Epstein on the verge of dismantling networks of power and blackmail. John McAfee with a data bomb set to drop. Brandy Vaughan documenting manipulation from inside the system. John Wheeler tracing billions through secretive channels. Aaron Swartz revealing surveillance veiled as progress. Gary Kildall and the energy freedom he never got to share. Michael Hastings chasing the media's secret masters. Karen Silkwood holding radioactive truths in her hands. Jeff Bradstreet challenging the boundaries of medical consensus. One by one, they fell, and one by one, their stories were rewritten or erased. Officially, heart attacks, suicides, car crashes, accidents. But unofficially, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, each was a subtraction from the collective memory. A line of thought that ended mid-sentence. A question no longer asked. This isn't a conspiracy tale. It's a human one. It's about the fragility of truth in systems where truth is inconvenient. It's about what we lose when courage goes unprotected. These weren't just deaths. They were vanishings of momentum, disappearances of potential futures. Possibilities that might have disrupted profits, power, and the narratives that hold them in place. And that is perhaps the most sobering thought, that truth alone is never enough. That without structures to guard it, communities to amplify it, and systems to uphold it, even the most urgent knowledge can vanish as quickly as breath. We don't know exactly who silenced these voices or how, but we know what their disappearance accomplished. Delay, confusion, normalcy. A return to the rhythm of the world before their questions were raised. Maybe some of these deaths were coincidences. Maybe not. But the pattern itself of disruption followed by erasure, of courage met with oblivion, is too precise to ignore. In the end, this story is not about final answers. It is about permanent questions. How do we build a world where truth can outlive the people who bear it? How do we protect those who carry dangerous knowledge, not just with words, but with systems? And how do we honor the legacy of those who died trying to open locked doors? We may never reclaim the full truths that died with them, but we can name the silence. We can recognize the cost, and in doing so, perhaps we create just enough light for the next truth-teller to step forward, because the war between power and truth is ongoing. And the next whisper of change may already be stirring, in the files someone dares to open, in the questions someone finally asks, in the stories someone refuses to let disappear. May we be ready to hear them. And more than that, may we be ready to protect them.